Varic Somme had catalogued 312 species in 4,000 years. He had met creatures with 17 eyes and creatures with none. He had sat across diplomatic tables from beings made mostly of gas, from beings that communicated through color changes in their skin, from beings so ancient they had forgotten they were once young. He had visited worlds so beautiful they made his chest hurt, and worlds so gray they made him feel like he had already died and was just waiting for someone to tell him. In 4,000 years, he had never once been surprised. He expected Earth to be no different. The file arrived on his desk 3 weeks before the delegation was scheduled to depart. He poured himself a cup of cold veth. He had been drinking it cold for 2 centuries, ever since the warming element on his kettle broke, and he had not found the disruption worth fixing, and he sat down to read. The file was thin. He had seen thicker reports written about single geological formations on uninhabited moons. The Galactic Conclave required every observer status applicant to complete a documentation package covering 47 mandatory categories. Humanity had completed all 47. Technically, but their answers were short, blunt. Some of them were so compressed that he found himself reading sentences that should have been paragraphs, and paragraphs that should have been full chapters, as if they had not quite understood that longer answers made better impressions, or as if they simply did not care about making an impression. He turned to Category 7, Dominant Philosophy of Cosmic Existence. This was the category where most species spent the most effort. The Keth wrote 40 pages. The Selhari wrote 70. The Dral, who had a warrior tradition going back 9,000 years and were very proud of having outgrown it, wrote 112. Humanity's answer was 4 words. We are still working on it. Varic Somme read it twice. Then a third time. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at the page again, as if one of them might have changed. It had not. He moved on. Category 31. History of Interspecies Conflict. This one was simple for most applicants. Most species, by the time they achieved spaceflight, had long settled their relationships with any other intelligent life in their home systems. Some had none to report. The answer was usually a list of treaties and a summary of how they were reached. Humanity's answer: none yet. We have not encountered other species prior to this process. He found the phrasing odd. None yet. Not none, none yet. As if they were taking note of a category that was currently empty, with the expectation that it might fill in later. As if conflict with other species was a thing they were simply waiting to get to. He filed the observation under Cultural Linguistics Possible Translation Error. Then he added a secondary tag, Low Priority. He read the rest of the file on the transport to Earth. It was a 6-day journey. He finished the file in 4 hours. He spent the remaining time reviewing his notes on the 312 species he had already catalogued, for no reason in particular, simply because the habit of reading old files calmed him, the way some people were calmed by music. He did not go back to the human file. He should have. Earth was green in a way that felt almost aggressive. He had seen green worlds before, several, but Earth's green was saturated in a way that suggested the planet was not simply growing things but actively insisting on them. The vegetation covered the hills the way a fever covers a face. Relentless, persistent, impossible to look at for long without feeling slightly overwhelmed. The human city they landed in was called Geneva. It had been chosen specifically for the delegation's arrival, he was told, because of its history, as a place where agreements were made. The humans had been using this city to formalize peace between themselves for several centuries. He noted that this implied they had needed to formalize peace between themselves many times. He filed that under Cultural Anthropology Standard Observation, did not tag it further. The diplomatic chamber was large. This was his first real surprise, though he would not call it that at the time. He would describe it in his notes as an architectural anomaly worth minor documentation. The room was far bigger than it needed to be. The ceiling was at least 3 times the height necessary for beings of human average size. The walls were pale, stone. There were many windows, positioned high and running all the way around the room so that light came from every angle equally. There were 4 doors, not 2-4, 1 in each wall, evenly spaced. One of the human support staff saw him looking around and assumed he was confused about something. It's an old building, she said helpfully. Pre-conclave, obviously. 18th century. He nodded politely and wrote in his personal journal, not his official report. The room has clear sight lines from every seating position to every entrance. The elevated windows prevent approach from outside without being seen. 4 exits positioned to prevent any seat in the room from being more than 12 meters from a door. This is not a diplomatic chamber. This is a room designed by people who have been ambushed in rooms before. He looked at what he had written. He almost crossed it out. He did not cross it out. He simply moved to the next page and wrote nothing else on the subject. The human delegation arrived exactly on time. This was notable. Most species arriving for their observer status admission arrived either slightly early, to demonstrate eagerness, or slightly late, to demonstrate confidence. Arriving exactly on time was a precision that suggested they had thought carefully about what the timing would communicate. Their lead diplomat was a woman named Adara Chen. She was not young, but she was not old either, in that human way where the two states bled together and produced something that simply looked like endurance. She wore a dark suit. No decorations, no status markings, no indications of rank. He would later learn that this was intentional. Human diplomatic dress had evolved toward minimalism specifically because rank markings were historically used to identify high-value targets. She shook his hand. Most species did not shake hands. It was a known human custom and the delegation had been briefed. He had practiced. He extended his hand and she took it and the grip was firm, noticeably firm. He was not a small being, and the grip registered. She held his gaze for approximately 3 seconds after the handshake ended. Then she smiled and welcomed him and the moment passed, smooth and professional, and the proceedings began. Later he would write in his personal journal, the handshake, the eye contact. I noted it as social aggression, a dominant signal, standard for species with competitive social hierarchies. Then, much later, he would add, I was not wrong about what it was. I was wrong about what it meant. But that was much later. The proceedings went smoothly. These things always did. Varic Somme had run 312 of them and they ran like water runs, finding the shape of the container and filling it. There were speeches. There were formal recognitions. There were the traditional conclave recitations, which he delivered in the standard manner, and which the humans listened to with expressions of polite attention that he recognized as a specific kind of face that beings made when they were listening carefully, but had also made up their minds already. Humanity was admitted to the conclave as an observer species, not a member. Observer. The distinction was considerable. An observer could attend sessions. An observer could speak. An observer had no vote, no formal military alliance, no claim on conclave resources or protection. It was, in the language of the conclave's own foundational documents, a status of acknowledged presence, which was exactly as limited as it sounded. The human delegation accepted this with a graciousness that was professionally deployed and, he suspected, privately irrelevant to them. He had the sense that they had not applied for observer status because they wanted protection or resources. He had the sense they had applied because they wanted to know how the room worked before they decided what to do in it. He filed that instinct nowhere. He did not trust it enough to write it down. After the formal session, the human hosts had arranged a reception. Food, drink, the particular kind of casual conversation that diplomatic functions required, which was not actually casual at all but was simply formality, wearing different clothes. He moved through it in the practiced way he had moved through 312 similar events. And then he saw it. One wall of the reception hall was a display, long, horizontal, running the full length of the room. He had assumed it was decorative and had paid it no attention, but at some point in the evening he found himself standing close enough to read it, and he stopped. It was a timeline, a human history timeline, specifically arranged for the delegation's visit. The humans had put it up themselves. It stretched from the earliest evidence of organized human civilization roughly 12,000 years ago in their reckoning to the present. It was clearly designed to show progress, technological development, expansion, the arc of a species becoming more. He read it from left to right. The thing was, he could not find a gap between wars, not a real one. There were centuries where the conflicts were smaller, where they occupied less of the timeline's annotations, but from the very beginning of recorded human history to somewhere in the mid-21st century, there was no point at which humanity had been, as a species, entirely at peace with itself. One conflict ended and another began. Sometimes they overlapped. Sometimes, in certain centuries, They ran 3 and 4 and 5 at once, in different parts of the same world, simultaneously. He stood there for what he later calculated was 11 seconds. The humans had put this up. They had chosen this, from all the things they could have displayed, to show a visiting delegation, a timeline of their wars, in the welcome hall. For the alien observers they were trying to make a good impression on. And looking at the faces of the human staff moving through the room, the researchers, the junior diplomats, the cultural liaison officers, he saw no awareness that this was unusual. No embarrassment. No pride either, which would have been concerning in a different way. Simply, here is our history. These things happened. You should know. He thought about writing it down. He thought about what tag to give it. He settled finally on cultural dissonance, low priority. He moved away from the display. He picked up a glass of something cool and amber and sweet that a human waiter offered him, and he stood near a window, and he looked out at the green city and he drank. The delegation departed the following morning. His official report on humanity was completed on the return journey. He was thorough. He was always thorough. He noted the planet's biosphere, its geopolitical structure, its technology level, its communication infrastructure, its energy production capacity. He noted that humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 200 years prior. He noted that their first Martian colony was 12 years old and had experienced 3 significant structural failures from which it had recovered each time. He noted that their unified global government was 40 years old, which was very young. He noted the handshake. He described it as a firm, tactile greeting consistent with a competitive social hierarchy, standard for species transitioning out of dominance-based interaction patterns. He noted the diplomatic chamber and described it as architecturally traditional for the region and period. He did not note the timeline. He did not note the none yet. He did not note the 11 seconds he had spent standing in front of a wall of wars, holding a drink, feeling something he did not have a clean word for. His conclusion was professional. It was precise. It was, in the formal language of conclave documentation, exactly what was expected. Humanity, observer status granted, species classification, developing, technological, trajectory, accelerated, notable, but not unprecedented, cultural development stage. Pre-philosophy, unified governance too recent to assess long-term stability, dominant behavioral tendencies, competitive, goal-oriented, high social bonding coefficient. Threat assessment, not required. Recommendation, standard monitoring protocol, no expedited attention necessary. He sealed the file. He sent it to the conclave archive. He poured himself a cold cup of veth, because the warming element was still broken, and he still had not fixed it. And he sat in his chair on the transport, and closed his eyes. He thought about the timeline. He thought about none yet. He thought about Adara Chen's hand in his, the 3 seconds of eye contact, the precise arrival time. He thought about the room with 4 doors. He opened his eyes. He picked up his file. He did not reopen it. He only held it. The way you hold something when you are trying to decide whether to put it back in a drawer or whether it belongs somewhere you can reach it quickly. After a long moment, he put it back in the drawer. He finished his cold veth. He moved on to the next file, the 313th species, a quiet people from a quiet world who farmed bioluminescent coral and had never once had a war and were very proud of this, and they were easy to categorize, and he was grateful. He did not think about Earth again for a long time. When he did, it would not be his choice. Lyra had always believed that violence was a sign of something unfinished. It was not an original thought. It was the foundational principle of the Selhari Conclave education system, taught in the first year of schooling, repeated every year after that, printed above the entrance to every government building on her homeworld. Violence is what a species does before it learns better. All advanced civilizations eventually put it down the way you put down a tool you no longer need. The Selhari had put it down 800 years ago. They considered themselves average in this regard, maybe slightly behind the curve. Most conclave species had shed violence earlier. She had believed this completely. She had been assigned to the Humanity Documentation Project with the enthusiasm of a researcher who expected to confirm something she already knew. Every new species required a formal, xenobiological report. Humanity had been granted observer status, and so it was time to write one. Standard procedure. She had done 3 such reports before. They usually took a few weeks. She would examine the biology, the brain chemistry, the evolutionary history, write up her findings, and move on. She packed for 3 weeks. She was there for 8 months. The first file she opened was the one on human skeletal structure. She read it in the morning, in a small rented office in the university district of a city called Nairobi, with hot coffee. She had developed a rapid addiction to human coffee that she was not proud of, and the sound of birds coming through the window that she could not identify, and did not stop to look up. She read the skeletal report, and when she finished it, she sat still for a long time. Then she read it again. The human skeleton was dense. She had known this from basic survey data. What she had not fully understood was why. The density was not simply a byproduct of the planet's gravity, which was only moderately high. The density was specific. It was concentrated in the long bones of the legs, in the joints, in the bones of the hands and the forearms. The marrow cavities were large, larger than any similar species, at comparable evolutionary stage. The marrow capacity was, in terms of raw blood production output, extraordinary. She looked up the reason. The reason was endurance. The large marrow cavities existed to sustain extended physical output, to keep producing red blood cells when the body had already burned through its normal reserves, to keep the muscles oxygenated past the point where other species' bodies would have forced a stop. The human skeleton was built with a reserve tank, a biological emergency supply for when the body ran out of fuel and needed to keep going anyway. She wrote in her notes, "This suggests evolutionary pressure favoring sustained physical activity past normal exhaustion thresholds. Requires further context." Then she opened the next file, muscle fiber composition. She understood, before she read this one, that there were 2 types of muscle fiber: fast twitch, for explosive movement, short bursts of maximum power, and slow twitch, for sustained effort, long, steady output, over time. Most species had a dominant type. It matched their ecological niche. Predators that hunted in short, fast sprints were mostly fast twitch. Species that traveled long distances as part of migration or foraging were mostly slow twitch. The balance between them was a biological signature. It told you how a species had survived, what it had been built to do. Humans had both, not a slight lean toward one or the other, not a moderate balance. A genuine, developed, functional abundance of both types, distributed across the body in a pattern that was, in the words of the study she was reading, statistically unprecedented among conclave survey species. She stared at this for a long time. What she was looking at was a body built to sprint and built to run long distances and built to do both of these things in the same body in the same lifetime. A body that could explode into motion and then sustain that motion. A body that could keep going after the explosion. That had reserves for when the reserves ran out. That had bones designed to not break under repeated impact, and muscles designed to not stop under sustained load. She wrote, "What ecological pressure produces this?" She underlined it. She did not have an answer yet. She ordered more coffee and opened the next file. The pain-tolerance studies were where she first started to feel something she did not have a comfortable word for. She read them carefully. She read them twice. She read several independently conducted studies because she thought the first one might be an outlier. It was not an outlier. The baseline pain threshold for most conclave species, the point at which the body's distress signal became overwhelming enough to prevent voluntary function, was fairly consistent across very different biologies. There were variations, but the general principle was the same. When the pain signal exceeded a certain level, voluntary control became impaired. The body protected itself. It slowed down, stopped, made the organism incapable of continuing, because continuing at that point was destruction. Humans did not work this way, or rather humans worked this way, but the threshold was dramatically, almost incomprehensibly, higher. She read documented cases of humans completing physical tasks after sustaining injuries that would have rendered most conclave species unconscious. Not unaware of the injury they knew. They were in pain. The pain was real and significant. They simply continued. One study examined human behavior following bone fractures. It found that a statistically significant percentage of humans with fractured bones in the extremities had completed the task they were engaged in before stopping to seek medical attention, not because they had not noticed, not because the fracture was minor, because they had made a choice. They had decided the task was more important than the signal from their own body saying stop. She read this, and she looked out the window at the trees, and she thought, every species has a limit, a wall that the body builds, a thing the body says, here, no further, this is where I protect you from yourself. She looked back at the file. Humans had the wall. They just treated it as a suggestion. She had been there for 2 months when a colleague named Dr. Peta Havili, a marine biologist, completely human, who had been assigned as her institutional liaison and had taken this role with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely enjoyed the company of aliens, asked how the research was going. She told him, carefully, what she had been finding. He listened, nodded occasionally, did not seem surprised. The endurance thing, he said. Yeah. There's a theory about that, called persistence hunting. She did not know this term. He explained it to her. He was a marine biologist, not an anthropologist, but he had clearly grown up knowing this, the way she had grown up knowing the conclave educational principles. It was something humans apparently just knew about themselves. The theory was this. Early humans were not the fastest thing on their planet, not even close. They could not outrun most of the large animals they hunted. What they could do, what nothing else on the planet could do, was keep going. They would pursue prey for hours, half a day, in the heat of the planet's primary star, which was extreme, across open ground, at a pace that was not fast, but did not stop. The prey animal, built for short, fast bursts of speed, would eventually overheat, would slow down, would stop, because its body forced it to stop. The human would still be walking toward it. She sat with this for a moment. So you hunted by refusing to stop? She said. Pretty much, he said. She looked at him. He was eating a sandwich. He had kind eyes. He was completely unbothered by what he had just said. And this was how long ago? She asked. He thought about it. A couple million years, give or take. She nodded slowly and wrote nothing down because she did not know where to put it yet. The neurology files arrived in her 4th month, and she read them in a single sitting that lasted 11 hours. The stress response. Every known species had one. The mechanism varied, but the principle was consistent. Mortal danger triggered a physiological state that changed behavior, increased certain capabilities temporarily, narrowed focus, prepared the body for emergency action. It was a survival mechanism, ancient, shared across most living things. What was not shared was what happened to humans inside that state. She read study after study, field reports, combat medical reports, accounts from humans, describing their experience in life-threatening situations. She read about adrenaline and what it did to the human body and brain. She read about the narrowing of time perception. Humans in extreme danger often described time slowing, their processing accelerating, the world becoming very clear and very simple and very manageable. This was documented in other species too, at lower intensity. What was not documented in other species was what she kept finding in the human accounts. The word that kept appearing, clarity, not fear, not panic, not the desperate incoherence of an animal in mortal danger. Humans in extreme mortal danger, repeatedly, across study after study, described a state of heightened clarity, of things suddenly being very simple, of knowing exactly what to do. Some described it as one of the most focused states they had ever been in. Some described it, with what she recognized as genuine discomfort at their own honesty, as almost pleasurable. She sent 3 excerpts to colleagues. She sent them without comment, just the raw text. She received 3 responses, all variations of, surely this is measurement error. She emailed back a list of the studies, 14 of them, different research teams, different decades. She did not receive a response to that email. She read the wars in her 6th month. She had been avoiding them. She knew they were there. The timeline from the Geneva Welcome Hall had been sitting in the back of her mind since she had first seen a photograph of it in Varic Somme's formal report, which she had been given access to as part of her research clearance. He had described it as architectural decoration in a footnote. She had looked at the photograph for a long time and thought, that is not decoration. She read every major human conflict, from the beginning of recorded history to the present. She approached it scientifically. She took notes. She charted causation and frequency and geographic distribution. She tracked the technology from handheld stone to directed energy weapons in what was, geologically speaking, almost no time at all. She tracked the casualty counts. She tracked the patterns of resolution, which conflicts ended in negotiation, which in exhaustion, which in the annihilation of one side. She did not read it to judge. She read it to understand a single question. How does a species that does this to itself survive? And the answer she arrived at was quiet and terrible, and she sat with it for a long time before she wrote it down. The species survived because the ones who were not good at surviving the violence did not survive it. For tens of thousands of years, the humans who were weaker and slower and felt more pain and stopped sooner and were less able to function through mortal stress, they died in the conflicts, or died because of the conflicts, or were outcompeted by the ones who didn't die. And the ones who didn't die had children who were slightly more like them. For tens of thousands of years, generation after generation, the species had been training itself, without knowing it was training, without any intention behind it, simply by existing in conditions that selected, over and over, for the ones who could endure. The conclave's peace was 9,000 years old. No conclave species had been under that kind of pressure for 9,000 years. Most for much longer. Humanity had been under it until, in geological terms, last week. She interviewed the retired soldier in her 7th month. His name was Marcos. He was 63 years old, which was moderately old for a human, and he had the look of someone who had been large and powerful in his youth, and had settled into a comfortable version of that without losing the essential structure. He had kind eyes. He offered her tea and she accepted it, and they sat in his small garden in the afternoon light. And she liked him immediately, which made the conversation both easier and harder. She explained her research. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. She asked him what combat had felt like. She asked it carefully, aware that it was an intrusive question, offering him the option to decline. He did not decline. He looked at his tea for a long moment, turning the cup slowly in his hands. Then he said, like being completely alive. He said it quietly, without dramatics. I know that sounds, he started. No, she said. I read the studies. I understand. I'm not proud of it, he said. That it felt that way. I know what it cost. I know what I saw. I'm not saying it was good. I know, she said. But you asked, he said. She nodded. They sat in the garden for a while after that and did not say anything. Birds made sounds in the trees. The light moved slowly. He topped up her tea without being asked. She flew home and did not submit her report for 6 weeks. She sat in her apartment on her homeworld and she looked at the mountains outside her window, clean gray peaks. No wars in their history. A planet that had found peace so long ago that the concept of conflict was almost academic, and she thought about everything she had found. The bones, the muscle fibers, the pain tolerance, the stress response, the wars, the retired soldier and his careful honesty. She thought about what she believed, about violence being the mark of something unfinished, about advanced species putting it down like a tool they no longer needed. She thought about that for a long time. Then she opened her report and began writing. She wrote for 4 days without stopping for much besides coffee and sleep, because the report was large and thorough and she had 8 months of findings to organize. When she reached the conclusion section, she stopped. She wrote the conclusion. She read it. She moved it to an appendix. Appendix C, which was the last appendix, which would be the last thing anyone read, if they read it at all. The conclusion read, humanity has not evolved past violence. Humanity evolved through it. The distinction is significant. A species that has shed violence as unnecessary has never been tested the way humanity has been tested. A species that has survived violence as selection pressure carries the results of that test in its bones, its neurology, its pain response, its stress chemistry, and its psychology. The conclave's working model of civilizational advancement, wherein violence is a stage to be outgrown, does not adequately account for a species that did not outgrow violence, but was, instead, shaped by it into something that cannot be straightforwardly categorized by existing frameworks. Reclassification is recommended. Priority. Urgent. She sealed the file. She sent it to the conclave. For 4 months, nobody mentioned Appendix C. She had expected this. She had written Appendix C for the moment when someone eventually did. Commander Thosval had studied war for 60 years and had never fought one. This was not unusual. The conclave's member species had maintained a documented peace for 9,000 years. The Dral, his people, had been the last to join that peace, and joining it had required them to dismantle a military tradition that stretched back 20 millennia. They had done it. Slowly, carefully, with the grief and relief and complicated pride of a people setting down something very heavy that they had been carrying for a very long time. The Dral military existed now as a ceremonial institution and a practical one: peacekeeping, disaster response, escort for deep space expeditions, real work, useful work, not war. Those Val had studied war the way scholars study extinct languages, with deep respect for the complexity of the thing, with a certain precision that came from understanding the subject at a remove, from the safety of time and distance. He had read everything, every campaign, every doctrine, every theorist from every era of conclave history. He understood strategy the way a surgeon understands anatomy completely, in the abstract, in the clean white space of theory where nothing bled. He thought this was sufficient. He would spend a long time later understanding that it was not. The Kreth Dominion's arrival was not announced. This was the first indication that things would not go as expected, because the conclave had a protocol for conflict initiation, a formal protocol, enshrined in law and custom, and 9,000 years of settled habit. You made contact. You declared your grievance. You waited for a response. The process was slow and formalized and occasionally frustrating, but it was the thing that kept wars from starting by accident, and for 9,000 years it had worked. The Kreth did not make contact. They did not declare a grievance. They did not wait. They crossed the conclave's border at 17 points simultaneously and began annexing. The word annexing was the one the initial reports used. It was a clean word, an administrative word. It made the thing sound like paperwork. What it actually meant was that 17 conclave border systems, 12 inhabited, 5 operating as scientific or trade stations, were surrounded by Kreth warships and informed that they were now Kreth territory. 3 of the stations attempted to respond to this information with the formal protest protocols. The Kreth did not answer the formal protest protocols. In 14 days, 17 systems were gone. The conclave convened in emergency session. Val was called to present his fleet assessment. He presented it carefully, clearly, with the measured professional calm of someone who had trained his whole life for exactly this kind of briefing. The conclave fleet was capable. Not large by historical standards, peace had allowed significant demilitarization, and nobody had objected to this because there had been nothing to object about but capable. Well maintained, equipped with the latest conclave weapons technology, crewed by professionals who had spent their careers in peacekeeping, and who were, in Val's honest assessment, very good at the kind of work they had actually done, and completely untested in the kind of work that was now being asked of them. He presented this assessment. He did not emphasize the last part as much as he perhaps should have. The human request arrived on the second day of the emergency session. A message from Ambassador Adara Chen, transmitted through the standard observer species channel, the channel that was, technically, for administrative communications only, for species that had no formal seat in conclave proceedings. She sent it to 7 recipients simultaneously, all 6 members of the Security Coordinating Council, and Val directly. The message was 11 words long. We would like to help. Please advise on how to coordinate. The Security Council debated the request for 4 hours. The arguments against were practical. Humanity had observer status only. No formal military alliance. No treaty obligation. No standing authorization to commit forces. The arguments for were also practical. Humanity had 40 warships currently within reachable distance of the crisis zone, and the conclave fleet was stretched across an incursion front that covered more territory than anyone had anticipated. In the end, the authorization was granted, not because the Council thought it would matter much. 40 ships was a gesture, a symbolic contribution, something they could point to later in the diplomatic proceedings as evidence of humanity's good faith participation. There was even a quiet satisfaction in some corners of the chamber at the idea of the new observer species being involved. It would give humanity a sense of investment in the conclave's stability. Nobody thought 40 ships would change anything. Val sent the coordination parameters and expected to hear nothing of consequence. The first engagement was 3 days later, at a system called Veth Kalos on the conclave's charts, and something unpronounceable on the Kreth's, a mid-sized system with 2 inhabited stations and a conclave garrison of 8 ships that had been surrounded and was broadcasting a distress signal on every available frequency. Those Val's main fleet was 6 hours out. The human squadron was 40 minutes out. He sent them the engagement data and told them to hold position until the main fleet arrived. The response came back in under a minute. It was from the human squadron commander. Her name was Commander Yael Adler. He had her file: 12 years of service, multiple commendations, specialist in multi-vector fleet coordination. The file had been optimistic about her. He had read it as diplomatic courtesy. Her response was 4 words: "Understood. We will wait." They waited 22 minutes. Then the distress signal from the Vethkalos garrison changed. The tone shifted. The frequency shifted. He had been in enough emergency scenarios to know what that shift meant. The garrison was preparing for boarding. The Kreth were moving to take the station directly, rather than waiting for any response to materialize. He was checking his calculations on fleet arrival time when another message came in from Adler. "Garrison is being boarded. We are going in." Not a request, not a consultation, an information transmission. The same tone as a weather report. He opened his mouth to order them to hold. The order was already irrelevant. The human squadron had moved. He watched it on the tactical display with the particular attention of someone trying to understand something that is not behaving according to the rules he knows. The human ships were ugly. He had noted this in his initial survey of their specifications. They were thick-hulled in a way that was deeply unfashionable in modern fleet design, where elegant profile reduction was considered both tactically and aesthetically correct. They were wide, heavy, overarmed in a pattern that looked almost paranoid, weapon systems positioned on every face of the ship, covering angles that standard tactical doctrine would have considered irrelevant. They were loaded with redundant systems in a way that made their engineering profiles look almost cluttered, like ships designed by someone who expected every possible thing to go wrong and had made arrangements for each possibility individually. They moved into the Kreth formation without broadcasting a challenge. This was the second thing that confused him. Formal challenge was standard. It was the basic signal of intent in any fleet engagement. You announced your presence and your purpose. You gave the opposing force the chance to adjust, and then the engagement began from a mutually acknowledged starting point. It was how you did it. He had studied 1,000 battles, and they all began this way because this was how rational actors engaged. With acknowledgement, with declaration, with the clear establishment of what was happening. The human ships did not declare anything. They simply attacked. The Kreth, he realized later, were also confused by this. They were not a species with a peaceful tradition, but they had their own version of engagement protocol, and its violation registered as something disorienting. They had been in the process of methodical, organized boarding when 12 ships appeared from a vector their sensors had labeled as low probability and started hitting them from 4 directions at once. The Kreth response was fast. They were not incompetent. They turned their formation and engaged. The first human ship to take a direct hit should have been done. Those Val watched his display. The hit was direct. It was significant. The energy discharge reading indicated severe damage to the port propulsion array. In any fleet he had trained with, in any engagement doctrine he had studied, that ship pulled back. It signaled impairment. It removed itself from the primary engagement zone and waited for assessment. The human ship kept moving forward. He thought his display was malfunctioning. He checked it. It was not malfunctioning. He pulled up the real-time telemetry from the human vessel. The propulsion array was damaged badly. They were compensating. On the telemetry, he could see power being rerouted in real time, manually, from secondary systems to keep thrust active on the remaining drives. He pulled up the internal camera feed because he needed to understand what he was seeing. There were humans crawling through the maintenance corridors of a ship that was actively under fire, physically rerouting power conduits by hand, while the vessel continued to engage. The ship took a second hit, less severe. They were already compensating for the first one. They simply extended the compensation to cover the second and continued. He sat back in his chair and looked at his display for a long moment. He thought, what doctrine is this? He found out what doctrine it was 3 hours later, sitting in his ready room with a cold cup of something, looking at the tactical replay on his screen. He had requested a full breakdown of the human squadron's engagement pattern. He wanted to understand what he had watched because it had worked. The garrison was intact. The Kreth forces at Vethkalos had withdrawn, and the system was secure, and he was a professional who believed in understanding things that worked. The pattern was simple once he saw it whole. The human ships had entered fast, absorbed the Kreth's initial response, and used their own damage and their own stubbornness, their refusal to retreat when hit, to pull the Kreth formation inward. The Kreth had moved to pursue, to finish damaged vessels, which is what you do when ships are damaged. It is the correct tactical response. But the human ships had not behaved like damaged ships. They had slowed down just enough to keep the Kreth following, compressing the Kreth formation inward, pulling their attention, and then the flanking elements of the human squadron had folded in from both sides simultaneously. He looked up the formation. It had a name, an old name, from human history, Cannae, a battle fought by humans against other humans, on a single continent of their own world, approximately 2,200 years before they had electricity. The basic principle, draw the center in, envelop the flanks, prevent retreat, had not changed in 2,000 years of human military development. They had invented it before they had metal tools capable of anything more than hand-to-hand range. They had still been using it when they reached the stars. He looked at the name for a long time. Then he pulled Lyra's xenobiological report. He read it. All of it. He found Appendix C at the end and read it twice. The campaign lasted 6 more weeks. He coordinated with Adler's squadron for all of it. This coordination was, initially, extremely frustrating, because human tactical communication did not follow Conclave Standard Protocol. Conclave Standard Protocol was formal, layered, designed to eliminate ambiguity through precision and specificity. You stated your position, your intent, your expected outcome, your contingency options, and your timeline. Adler's communications were short, sometimes very short. Moving to flank. Cover our exit. They're clustering on your position. Push through. Don't wait for us. Go. The first few times, he had asked for clarification. She had sounded, across the comms channel, mildly impatient with the need for clarification, as if the situation were self-explaining and the words she had sent were the necessary and sufficient description of what was required. She was not rude about it. She simply did not understand, on some deep level, why he needed more information than she had given him. He had begun, by the 3rd week, to understand her communications. He was not proud of how long it had taken. What he came to understand was this. Adler did not send long messages because she did not have long messages to send. She looked at a situation and she saw what needed to happen, and she sent that and expected it to be done. There was no gap between assessment and decision, no consultation, no formal weighing of options. She saw, she decided, she acted. He had studied this in the historical texts. He had read about commanders who operated this way. He had read the psychological literature on rapid tactical cognition. He had thought, for 60 years, that he understood it. He had not understood it. He had understood it the way you understand swimming before you are ever in the water. In the 5th week, a Kreth cruiser got through the outer engagement line and reached a civilian transport carrying 4,000 Selhari heading to a border colony. The cruiser's weapons powered up. Its intent was clear. The nearest Conclave ship was Thosval's own command vessel. He calculated the intercept time. He began issuing orders. He was still issuing orders when the human ship, Adler's own ship, which had already taken 3 significant hits in the previous 2 days, and by rights, should have been pulled back for assessment, crossed his screen at a speed that his sensors briefly flagged as an error, because it did not align with what his damage assessment said the ship was capable of. The human ship put itself between the Kreth cruiser and the civilian transport. That was all. No complicated maneuver, no tactical elegance. Just a damaged ship moving to a position where it would have to be destroyed before the transport could be touched. The Kreth cruiser fired. The human ship took it. It did not stop. He would think about this moment for a very long time. The sensor data showed the human ship sustained damage that his damage assessment algorithms evaluated at 63% mission capability loss. The algorithm said, "This ship is no longer an effective combat asset." The ship disagreed with the algorithms. It returned fire, and Thosval, who had studied war for 60 years, who knew every doctrine, every formation, every theory of engagement that had ever been committed to writing by any species in the conclave, Thosval, crossed the distance at full speed to assist, and he found himself doing it not because his tactical assessment said it was optimal, but because watching that damaged, stubborn, stupid, magnificent ship refuse to stop had done something to his calculations that he could not explain with the formal language of strategy. The Kreth withdrew from the border on the 41st day. Their commander sent a formal communication requesting ceasefire terms. Thosval handled the response with the precise professionalism of someone who had trained for this moment, even though he had never expected to live it. After the terms were transmitted and acknowledged, he opened a channel to Adler. He wanted to issue a formal commendation. This was protocol. He had the language prepared. He had the correct form of words. She answered the channel. Her voice was tired. The deep, flat, used-up tired of someone who had been running on something other than rest for 6 weeks and had finally put it down. He issued the commendation. She received it with a brief and genuine thanks. Then he asked the question. Not the formal one. The other one. Why did you do it? He said. The transport. You were already severely damaged. There were other ships in range. You were not the optimal choice. Towned. She was quiet for a moment. There were 4,000 people on that transport, she said. Yes. So? That is all? She seemed to consider the question seriously, as if she was not sure if he was asking something simple or something complicated and was trying to determine which before she answered. Yeah, she said finally. That's usually enough. He closed the channel. He sat in his command chair, in the particular silence that comes after the noise stops, and he looked at his hands, and he thought about 60 years of studying war from a distance, about cannae and cold calculations and damage assessments and algorithms that said a ship was no longer effective. He thought about a ship that had not consulted the algorithm. He pulled up a communications request. He addressed it to Varic Somme. He had one question. Did you read Appendix C? He sent it and sat back and waited. And outside his viewport the stars were very quiet. And somewhere in the distance, floating in the debris field of 6 weeks of fighting, was a human ship, held together by manual rerouting and stubbornness, and something he still did not have the right word for. He thought he was beginning to understand the word, though. He was beginning to understand it had always been right in front of him. On a timeline in a welcome hall in Geneva, on a world so green it hurt to look at, he just had not known what he was reading. Sene had known for 4 years. She had not told anyone, because no one had asked her specifically, and because the information lived in a space between categories not alarming enough to report as a security concern, not irrelevant enough to dismiss, not easily summarized without sounding like she had lost her professional objectivity, which was the specific fear of every attaché who spent too much time with their assigned species. You were supposed to study them. You were not supposed to understand them so well that you ran out of the right distance. She had lost the right distance somewhere in the 2nd year. She had kept doing her job anyway, because the job still needed doing, and because she was very good at it, and because losing the distance had, in its own way, made her better at it. She knew things about humanity that no formal report captured. She knew things that lived in the texture of the daily ordinary in the way they talked and ate and argued and laughed, and refused to leave when they should have left, and came back when she had expected them to be gone. She knew what they were. She had known for 4 years. And now she was sitting in an emergency session of the Galactic Conclave, and the chamber was very quiet, and Varic Somme was looking at her with the expression of a being who had just read Lyra's Appendix C and was trying to understand why it had taken him this long. You were assigned to humanity 6 years ago, he said. You have been in closer sustained contact with them than any Conclave representative currently serving. I would like you to share your assessment. She looked at him. Then she looked at the chamber. There were 93 representatives present. Every significant conclave species, every major power, all of them watching her with the focused attention of beings who had spent the last 3 days absorbing the news from the Kreth border and trying to decide what exactly they had authorized when they gave humanity permission to participate. She took a breath. All right, she said, but I need you to understand that what I'm going to tell you is not a threat assessment. I am not here to tell you whether to be afraid of them. I am here to tell you what they actually are, because I don't think any of the formal documentation quite captures it, and I think you need to understand it before you decide anything. She paused. No one objected. she began. She told them about the children first, not because it was the most strategically relevant thing, because it was the thing that had changed her understanding the fastest. In the earliest days, when she had still been doing her job from the correct distance and cataloging observations with proper professional detachment, she had been invited to a social event. This was standard for attachés. Integration with civilian life was encouraged. The event was something humans called a birthday party, a celebration of the anniversary of a person's birth, which they held every year, which she had found charmingly excessive before she understood the reasoning. The child whose birthday it was had become sick. Not seriously a mild respiratory infection, the kind that passed in a day or two with rest, but sick enough that the child had been put to bed, and the party had been adjusted, and the parents had taken turns sitting with the child through the night. She had observed this. She had thought, initially, that it was a cultural ritual, some formalized response to illness. She had asked a human colleague the next day, in the most casual terms she could manage, whether this was a standard practice. Her colleague had looked at her as if she had asked something slightly strange. "If your kid is sick," her colleague said slowly, "you sit with them." "The whole night?" "Yeah, of course." She had thought about this for days. The parent had been visibly exhausted the following morning, had not slept, had gone directly from a night of sitting with a mildly ill child to a full day of work without complaint, had, in fact, seemed almost confused when Sene expressed sympathy about the lack of sleep, as if the sympathy were misdirected, as if sitting up through the night was simply the thing that was done, and therefore not a hardship worth noting. She told the chamber, "There is a human word, vigil. It means to keep watch over someone through the night. In their history, it was originally a religious observance, but they use it now for secular purposes too, for sitting with the ill, for sitting with the dying, for sitting, simply, with someone who should not be alone. They do not regard this as sacrifice. They regard it as a minimum, the floor of what you owe someone who is vulnerable." She paused to let this sit. "A species that does not sleep when its young are threatened," she said, "is not a species you categorize simply by examining its weapons." She told them about the laughter. This one was harder to explain. She had struggled with it for years. She still struggled with it. 6 months into her posting, there had been a serious incident aboard a human research vessel she was traveling on. A catastrophic mechanical failure in one of the life support systems. Not fatal, the backup systems had activated, but serious enough that for approximately 40 minutes, the situation had been genuinely uncertain. The crew had worked through those 40 minutes with the focused intensity she had come to expect from humans in crisis. She had watched from a safe position, as per her briefing protocols, and she had catalogued their behavior. Calm, efficient, rapid, coordinated, all expected. What she had not expected was the joke. In the middle of the crisis, with oxygen levels still not fully stabilized, and 3 crew members still working physically in a damaged section of the ship, one of them had said something. She had not caught the full content because it was delivered fast. In a regional dialect she was still learning. But the crew had laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not the hysterical laughter of people whose composure was breaking. Genuine laughter. The real kind. Brief, sharp, and then gone, and then back to work. She had reviewed the audio logs afterward. The joke was not particularly funny. It was not even a complete joke, more of an observation, a dark one, about the irony of their situation. But the laughter had been real. She had spent considerable time trying to understand this. What she had eventually concluded was this. The laughter was not a failure of seriousness. It was evidence of something she did not have a clean translation for, a quality that allowed a human in a dangerous situation to hold the danger at arm's length long enough to see the absurdity of it. Not because they did not understand the danger, because they understood it completely and had decided, in that moment, that it did not get to be the only thing in the room. They laugh, she told the chamber, at things that are trying to kill them. Not always, not everyone, but often enough that I stopped being surprised by it and started understanding it as a tool, a thing they reach for when the pressure becomes a certain kind of unbearable. They make it small by making it funny, and then they keep working. She saw some faces in the chamber that were not following her. She tried a different way. "You are afraid of what they might do," she said. "I understand that. I am trying to tell you what they actually are. And part of what they are is a species that can be terrified and exhausted and injured and still find a moment to make each other laugh. I have watched them do this. I know what it looks like. It looks like people who have decided, at some very deep level, that their situation does not define them, that they are always bigger than whatever is happening to them. The chamber was quiet. That is very useful in a war, she said. It is also just true about them in general. On ordinary days, with ordinary problems, they are the same species. She told them about how they mourned. This was the part she had been most afraid to include, because it was the part that had, in her second year, broken her professional distance and never quite given it back. Senna's homeworld had been destroyed before the conclave, before the peace. Old history, ancient by most reckonings, though not by conclave standards. The planet was gone. The people were scattered across 7 different systems, integrated into conclave civilization, technically thriving. The grief was old enough that most people who weren't Mirathi didn't know to ask about it, and most Mirathi had learned not to bring it up, because the grief was old and the present was good and there was no practical point in doing anything with it. She did not talk about her homeworld. She talked about human grief instead. She told them about the monuments. Every human civilization, across every culture, had built them. Structures whose sole purpose was to hold the names of the dead soldiers, victims of disasters, people taken by sickness, large stone walls covered in names, entire cities built around an absence. She described visiting a place called a war memorial in a human capital city and watching a woman stand in front of a long black wall of names and run her fingers along the carved letters of one specific name and then press her forehead to the stone. She stood there for a long time. No one spoke to her. The other humans around her gave her the space with an ease that suggested this was understood. That this was a thing you gave someone when they came to find a name on a wall. They say the names out loud, Sene told the chamber. On the anniversaries of losses, publicly. They gather and they say the names of the dead one by one, all of them, however many there are, however long it takes, so that the dead do not become numbers, so that the dead do not become abstract. She stopped for a moment. A species with a short lifespan cannot afford long grief, she said. The grief would consume too much of the life, but humans have long enough lifespans that they can grieve for years. Only, they can build their grief into their architecture, into their ceremonies, into the way they mark time. They carry their dead with them, indefinitely, because they have decided that the dead are worth carrying. She let this sit. I want you to understand what I am describing, she said. I am describing a species that feels loss deeply, and permanently, and publicly, and that still fights. Not because they do not understand what they are risking, because they understand exactly what they are risking, and they have decided that some things are worth risking it for, anyway. Varic Somme spoke. Envoy Sene, he said, with the particular careful precision of someone choosing words that might become part of the formal record. You have described their emotional texture, with considerable depth, but the chamber's primary concern is tactical. Following the Kreth engagement, we are faced with the question of humanity's formal military integration into the conclave's defense structure. And before that question can be answered, the chamber would like to know your assessment of the following. Are they a threat to the conclave? She looked at him. The chamber waited. She had known this question was coming. She had been preparing for it for 6 years in the back of her mind, in the way you prepare for a conversation that you know is coming but can't quite start. She had prepared 3 different versions of an answer: a diplomatic answer, a technical answer, an honest answer. She had decided, on the transport coming here, to give the honest one. They saved 17 systems, she said. They saved the Selhari transport. They took losses they were not required to take, for species they have known for less than 3 years, because someone had to, and they were there. That was not the question, Varic Somme said. No, she agreed. It wasn't. She was quiet for a moment. The question you are asking, she said, is whether they will ever point what they are at us. Whether the thing that stopped the Kreth could become the thing that threatens the conclave itself. And I understand why you are asking it. It is a reasonable thing to be afraid of. She looked around the chamber. But I want you to consider something. You built this conclave 9,000 years ago. You built it to be the alternative to the thing you were afraid of. You built it so that species would not have to fight each other, so that the war that ended the Herath would be the last war. You built it because you knew what that kind of violence cost, and you decided the cost was too high. She paused. Humanity has been fighting for as long as they have been human. They have fought each other for resources and ideology and territory, and sometimes just because they could. They have lost unimaginable numbers of their own people in conflicts that, in retrospect, they themselves describe as pointless. They know this. They are not unaware of what they have been. They have built museums to the worst things they have done to each other. They have written the names of every person the worst things cost. They carry it. She looked at Varic Somme, and in the first test they faced, on behalf of people they owed nothing to, they put themselves between those people and the danger, without being asked, without a treaty obligation, without any formal structure requiring them to do it. She stopped. They are not the Herath, she said quietly. The Herath fought because they could not stop. Humanity fights because they decide to. And the first time they had to decide with the whole galaxy watching, they decided to protect. The chamber was silent. She sat down. She had not answered the question directly. She knew she had not answered the question directly. She had given them everything around the answer, and left the answer itself, in the empty space in the middle, where they would have to find it themselves. Varic Somme looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the chamber and opened the formal session. She looked at her hands in her lap and thought about a woman pressing her forehead to a wall of names, about a crew laughing in a damaged corridor, about a ship that was too damaged to fight, still fighting. She thought about a name on a wall that she had never said out loud in 4,000 years because she had been afraid that saying it would not help. She thought, maybe they understand something about that too. She did not say this. She sat quietly and waited for the session to proceed. And outside the chamber's high windows, the stars were the same stars they had always been, indifferent and ancient, keeping no record of the names of the dead. She kept her own record. She always had. The vote was 619 to 228. Full membership. Not observer status. Not provisional admission with conditions. Full membership in the Galactic Conclave, with all rights, responsibilities, and formal treaty protections that entailed. Humanity had been an observer species for less than 2 years. Varic Somme had processed 312 membership admissions in 4,000 years. The fastest previous admission, the Selhari, who had been aggressively pursuing membership for decades and had submitted a documentation package so thorough it required a separate storage archive, had taken 4 years. The average was 11. He filed the paperwork for humanity in the empty chamber at the end of the day. Everyone else had gone home. The session had ended. The vote had been recorded. The delegations had dispersed to their transport arrangements and their diplomatic receptions and their private conversations about what this meant. The chamber staff had cleaned and shut down the formal systems, leaving only the archival station active and the emergency lighting on, which cast the room in a pale blue that made everything look like it was underwater. He sat at the archival station and completed the documentation package. The package was thorough. He was always thorough. He had not become the longest-serving conclave archivist in institutional history by being anything less than thorough. He checked every field, cross-referenced every category, verified that the correct treaty language was appended in all 47 required sections. When he reached the species classification field, he paused. It was a drop-down menu. Standardized categories, the same ones that had been in use for most of the conclave's 9,000 years of formal operation. He had used the same menu 312 times. He knew it by memory. His hand moved to it. He did not click. He sat in the underwater blue light and looked at the menu and thought about the categories, and the categories looked back at him like old familiar furniture that had always fit the room. They did not fit this. He had pulled his original file on humanity 3 days ago, the one he had written on the transport back from Earth. 4 cold cups of Veth and 6 days of careful professional distance, and 47 completed categories, and a conclusion that he now read, with the particular quality of attention that you give to something you wrote before you understood what you were writing about. Minor species, pre-philosophy, no threat assessment required. He read it twice. He had been doing this job for 4,000 years. In 4,000 years, he had never once written a species classification that required significant revision. He wrote careful things. He wrote accurate things. He took his time and he was thorough, and his files did not require revision. This one required revision. He had understood this in stages. First, Lyra's report Appendix C, which those Val had forwarded to him with a message that was 3 words long. "Did you read this?" Then the tactical reports from Vethkalos. Then Sena's testimony. Then the vote. At each stage he had understood more, and at each stage the understanding was not entirely comfortable. In the way that revising something you were certain about is never entirely comfortable. There is a specific kind of discomfort that comes from finding out that you were not wrong about the facts but wrong about what the facts meant. It is different from simply being wrong. In some ways it is harder. He had been right that humanity was a minor species in terms of its conclave footprint. Small fleet, no energy weapons, limited infrastructure. He had been right that their philosophy of cosmic existence was underdeveloped. He had been right that they were pre-philosophy in the sense that they had not codified a formal framework for their place in the universe. He had been wrong about what pre-philosophy meant. He had assumed it meant not yet mature, not yet arrived at the settled conclusions that advanced species arrived at. Still in the messy early stages. What it actually meant, in humanity's specific case, was they were too busy doing things to spend much time writing systems about why doing things was correct. The philosophy was not absent. It was distributed. It lived in the woman pressing her forehead to a wall of names, in a crew laughing in a damaged corridor, in 11 words sent through an observer channel that was technically only for administrative communications. "We would like to help. Please advise on how to coordinate." He had read those 11 words at the time as diplomatic positioning. As a new species finding ways to be visible, to be useful, to accumulate the goodwill that would eventually translate into formal standing, he read them now for what they were. "We would like to help." Not, "We would like to demonstrate capability." Not, "We would like to formalize an alliance." Not, "We assess strategic advantage in participation." "We would like to help." That was the whole sentence. That was the whole thought. He thought about the wrath. He always thought about the wrath eventually, when he thought carefully about anything involving the history of the conclave. The wrath were the reason the conclave existed. The peace was built on the wound they left. 9,000 years of managed peace, purchased at the cost of a species purchased by the conclave, which had made the decision that the wrath's continued existence was incompatible with the survival of everyone else. He had been there, not present at the final action, too junior, too far, but present in the era. He had read the reports in real time as they arrived. He had filed the formal documentation. He had written, in the cold, clear language of the archive, what had been done and why and what it had cost. He kept a private file on the wrath that he had never submitted to any formal system. It contained only one entry, written 4,000 years ago in his personal journal, never revised, never expanded. "We did what we did because there was no other way. I believe this. I will always believe this. I am not sure believing it is the same thing as it having been right." He had left that entry alone for 4,000 years because he did not know what to do with it, and doing nothing with it felt like the most honest option. He thought about it now because of Sene's testimony. The part about the wrath being a species that fought because it could not stop. The wrath fought because they could not stop. Humanity fights because they decide to. He had been sitting with this sentence for 3 days. He sat with it now, in the underwater blue light. The distinction was not small. A species that cannot stop is a species operating from biological compulsion, from something so deep in the structure of what it is that choice does not enter into it. The wrath had not chosen violence any more than a river chooses to flow downhill. It was simply what they did, because it was all they had been built to do. Humanity had been built for war. He accepted this now, sitting in the quiet chamber with Lyra's appendix in his memory, built for war the way the Herath had been, shaped by the same grinding selection pressure, honed over the same impossible timescale into something that could absorb and endure and continue past the point where other things stopped. But they had also been built for the woman and the wall of names, for the crew that laughed in the burning corridor, for 11 words sent through the wrong channel because they did not know how to watch something happening and not try to help. The wrath had been one thing, a blade. A blade was very good at cutting and could not do anything else, and eventually it cuts everything within reach. And then there is nothing left. Humanity was. He turned the word over. He had been turning it over for days. Humanity was something that had all the properties of a blade and had decided, largely, not to be one. Not through weakness, not through inability, through decision, through the quiet, daily choice of beings who knew what they were capable of and had decided that capability did not equal obligation. He thought, the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy is a predator that chose to become something else, because it still has the teeth. He opened the drop-down menu again. He looked at the categories. He closed the drop-down menu. He opened a new text field, the notes section of the formal admission file, which was technically optional and almost never used by anyone because the categories were considered sufficient, and he began typing. He wrote for a long time. He wrote about the skeleton files and the pain-tolerance studies. He wrote about Kane and a ship that refused to stop. He wrote about 11 words and a woman and a wall. He wrote about Cinna and what she had not said and what she had meant by not saying it, which he had understood only afterward, sitting in the empty chamber thinking about 4,000 years of careful categorization and the specific quality of being wrong about what something means. He wrote about his own report. Minor species, no threat assessment required. He did not apologize for it. He did not revise it. He simply noted it, and noted the date, and noted what he understood now that he had not understood then. He saved the notes. Then he went back to the classification field. He selected the nearest applicable category, the one that said, in the formal language of the conclave taxonomy, emerging strategic partner, assessment, ongoing. He looked at it. He did not love it. It was not accurate. It was approximate. But 4,000 years had taught him that the archive was better served by approximate honesty than by false precision, and the honest truth was that he did not have a category that fit, and creating a new category required a proposal and a review committee, and, at minimum, 6 months of formal consideration, and the file needed to be completed tonight. He saved the classification. He stood up. The corridor outside the chamber was quiet. The building kept late hours, the support staff worked in shifts. There were always people somewhere, but this wing, at this hour, was empty. His footsteps were the only sound. He walked slowly. He often walked slowly. It was not age. His species did not age the way most species aged. It was simply the habit of someone who had been walking for 4,000 years and had stopped needing to arrive anywhere quickly. He was almost to the exterior door when he heard it. Movement. The soft sound of someone in the small waiting area at the end of the corridor. The room with the low chairs and the table, and the large window that looked out over the conclave's formal gardens. He glanced in as he passed. A human, young, early in their career, by the look of it mid-20s in their own reckoning, which was very young by almost any standard. A junior diplomatic attaché, based on the identification badge. He recognized the face from the edges of the day's proceedings. One of the people who stood at the back of rooms and handed documents to people who needed documents and made sure things ran. Essential work, invisible work, the kind of work that kept everything functioning and that no one noticed until it stopped. She was sitting in one of the low chairs. On the table beside her was a small container of food, something portable, the kind of thing you brought from home when you expected a long day, and a data reader, which she had set face down on the table and was apparently not currently reading. She was looking out the window at the dark gardens. The lights in the gardens were amber. It made everything outside look warm. She must have heard his footstep pause. Because she looked up, she did not seem startled. She seemed the way people seem when they are tired, but not unhappily so, used up in a productive way. The way you feel after finishing something that mattered. She saw him. She smiled. It was a completely simple smile. Unguarded. The kind of smile that happens automatically, without calculation, because a face does it when it sees another face, and there is no particular reason not to. Long day, she said. Yes, he said. You're the archivist, she said. You filed the admission papers? Just now, he said. She nodded slowly. She looked back out at the amber gardens for a moment. Weird, isn't it? She said. Being official? He was not sure what to say to this. He considered several responses and none of them felt right. For us too, she said, as if he had asked. Some of us keep waiting for it to feel real. Like we're still not sure we belong here. You fought for 17 systems that weren't yours, he said. You belonged here before the vote. She looked at him again. The smile came back, slightly different this time, smaller, more real. Don't tell the Security Council that, she said. They're still writing it up. He found himself doing something he had not expected to do. He almost smiled. It was a near thing. It did not quite complete itself, but the machinery of it moved, which was more than had happened in a very long time. Go home, he told her. Sleep. In a minute, she said. She picked up her container of food. You want some? It's cold, but it's good. He looked at the container. He thought about 4,000 years of cold veth and a warming element he had never fixed. What is it? He asked. Rice, she said, and some other stuff. My grandmother's recipe. I always make too much. He sat down in the chair across from her. She handed him a portion in a small side container. He ate it. It was cold. It was made of ingredients he could not entirely identify. It was, for reasons that were probably more about the hour and the day and the amber gardens than about the food itself. Quite good. They sat there for a while. The junior diplomat looked out the window. He looked at his hands. Outside, the conclave's gardens were very still. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Do you think this is going to work? Us being here, being part of this. He thought about the classification field, the drop-down menu, the new text field and everything he had written in it. He thought about none yet and 4 doors and a timeline of wars in a welcome hall and 11 words in the wrong channel. He thought about a ship that refused to stop. I don't know, he said. And then, because he was thorough, because he was always thorough, because 4,000 years had taught him that the honest thing was usually the more accurate thing. But I think the answer to that question depends more on you than on us. She nodded. She seemed to accept this without needing it explained. They finished the rice. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. He walked out into the cool dark of the conclave's main courtyard and stood for a moment looking up at the sky above the city, the stars half hidden by the light of the buildings. He thought, I have catalogued 313 species. He thought, I do not have a category for this one. He walked to his transport. In his pocket, his personal journal, the private one, the one that had held the Krath entry for 4,000 years without revision, was open to a new page. He had written 2 words before the vote. He looked at them now, in the transport's overhead light, as the city moved past outside. Humanity. Reclassified. Below those 2 words, the page was still empty. The classification field, like the one in the formal archive, was still blank. He held the journal in his lap. He watched the city go past. He thought, it does not need a word tonight. Some things do not need a word the moment you understand them. Some things need time to find their name. He closed the journal. He looked out the window. He thought about all the species he had known. The ones who had been afraid. The ones who had been proud. The ones who had come into the conclave chamber with their history in a file and their hope held carefully in front of them, like something fragile. He thought about a junior diplomat eating cold rice in an empty corridor after a very long day, looking out at amber gardens, asking if this was going to work. He thought about what he had said. It depends more on you than on us. He thought, I believe that. I have believed things for 4,000 years and been wrong about some of them. I believe this one. The transport moved through the quiet city. The stars did their ancient indifferent work above the buildings. The journal stayed closed. The page stayed empty. Some things take time to find their name. He was patient. And he had always been patient. He could wait.